I originally wanted to meet with all of you at some time in 2018, but as we all know, on December the 1st, there was a detention of Ms. Meng Wanzhou. So I have been very busy and preoccupied with handling with this issue. Based on the U.S. request to Canada, on the arrest of Ms. Meng, we not only reached out to the Canadian side, but also to the U.S. side. There's not the issue of who do we lodge our objection to mainly. Maybe you feel this way is because Ms. Meng is currently detained in Canada, not in the U.S. As for your second question about the belief by some Chinese that the Canadian Prime Minister and the Canadian government have influence on Canadian court, this is not a statement made by the Chinese side. It is actually implied and suggested or indicated by relevant Canadian laws and the extradition treaty between Canada and the U.S. Because after all, Canada is currently run by the Liberal government. As the government of Canada is our main channel of communication, of course. As for the compulsory measures were taken against these two Canadian nationals. As for the statement, as it being a reprisal against the detention of Ms. Meng, is not a statement made by the Chinese side. Rather, it is a statement made by Canadian media. I have never made any kind of statement like this in any occasion. I believe these are, on the other hand, two different matters of very different nature. The detention of Ms. Meng is groundless because she did not violate any Canadian law, but on the other hand, the detention of the two Canadian nationals were due to suspicion of their engagement in activities that endanger China's national security. Ms. Meng is innocent, but based on the relevant information and reports we've seen so far, that China does have legal charges against these two Canadians. Since the arrest of Ms. Meng, as for how many Canadians are detained in China, I don't have the specific number, but according to Canadian media reports, there are currently over 200 Canadian nationals being detained in China. But there are 900 U.S. nationals currently being detained in China. China is a country based on the rule of law, and China will not arbitrarily detain or arrest anyone. Any citizens or any nationals around the world, as long as they abide by Chinese laws and regulations, their safety and security in China can be assured. Yes, I'm always concerned that Canada would make this kind of decision like US, Australia, and New Zealand made in the past. And I believe this kind of decision is not fair because it's not based on any evidence. I have been following reports on this issue for a long time, and these Five Eyes Alliance countries have been saying that Huawei poses a national security threat to these countries, but they have never shown any evidence. Recently, I read some of the interview made by Huawei chairman to the media, and he mentioned that the United States has never even used the Huawei equipment. So how does the US know that Huawei poses a threat to the country? He also said that if the US has any evidence to support that argument, even if it doesn't want to show the evidence to Huawei, it can show the evidence to other countries and telecommunication companies. In Western countries, your legal system or your system puts a lot of emphasis on evidence, but why not putting more emphasis on evidence in this case? That's why I suspect these kind of accusations have ulterior motives. So some countries propose the idea of banning Huawei equipment not out of concern for national security, but rather for other motives. This kind of accusation, only based on guess and suspicion, cannot be sustained. I hope that the Canadian government and relevant authorities and bodies could make a wise decision on this issue. But if the Canadian government does ban Huawei from participating in the 5G network, as for what kind of repercussions there will be, I am not sure. The Canadian media have very strong reaction to my article published last week, probably mainly due to some of the expressions that I used in the article, including the white supremacy. Please note that I used this kind of expression in a critical tone, not the other way around. And I was not accusing the entire Canadian society, but rather some people in the society. And I do have evidence and supporting points to support my argument and to support my criticism of these people. As you can see from the article, there are very clearly explained points supporting this view. I understand that the Canadian government and the Canadian society resolutely oppose white supremacy, but this kind of opposition doesn't mean that it doesn't exist in Canada. Some people do have deep-rooted views or values of white supremacy, and when external conditions change, these views and values will be reviewed. And recently I noticed from the remarks by Canada's public security minister saying that white supremacy is indeed a problem in Canada and is a concern in Canada. As for your question about whether the recent unpleasant developments in Canada-China relationship does, of course, have an impact on the bilateral trade. Both sides have been very actively pushing forward these free trade talks, and we have already conducted 4 rounds of exploratory talks, and a lot of differences have already been resolved. But due to some new factors emerged recently, this process has been affected, but this is not caused by China.